right, so here is our first video lecture. This one is going to go over communicating science to the public. So we're going to go over 10 tips. This is from Monica Metzler. She is an executive director from the Illinois Science Council. So I pulled some of the tips that she had put together and kind of made it a little bit more relevant to our discipline. But she gave some of these tips on public outreach during an annual meeting. So here are the 10. We're going to take a look at them one by one. So the first one is science outreach is important. In the United States, we kind of have comparatively a low scientific literacy rate. And so I think a lot of the things that we see that we think are ridiculous in terms of what the consumer believes or how susceptible they are to misinformation, we can see this on a larger scale when it comes to things like fad diets or the anti-vaccination movement, or other things that we can think about and say, wow, this is ridiculous. How do they not understand or realize the science that tells us otherwise? But when we really get down to the numbers, we've been fairly stable in the United States in terms of literacy rate for science information. In 2016, the National Science Board noted that performance on science knowledge has been stable across about across 2 decades. So they went through in 2014 and did a representative sample of adults in the United States, and they were able to correctly answer, on average, about 65% of knowledge questions. And we've seen this kind of be the case for a while. There is room for improvement. The American Association of the Advancement of Science Symposium had presented a paper titled "The Science Literacy in Pseudoscience." This was published out of Minnesota State University. John Miller said that Americans are slightly ahead of the European countries when it comes to scientific knowledge, but we still have a long way to go. So still wanting to strive for more comprehension. But a slightly higher proportion of American adults qualify as scientifically literate than Europeans or Japanese adults. But the truth is that no major industrial nation in the world today has a sufficient number of scientifically literate adults. And then Miller went on to state that we should take no pride in finding that 70% of Americans cannot read and understand the science section of the New York Times. And so we do have a lot of room for improvement. For us in the ag industry, one of the biggest things is policy determines how we operate. Everything that goes on in DC is a direct result of lobbyists and the public opinion or outcry. And so when we have a lot of consumers that are provided with misinformation and believe one thing, they can push for legislation and policy to change the status quo. And that will have, when in the terms of food production or agriculture and commodities, that will affect us. So it's important. We have to pay attention to it. When we talk about you as a professional, when you get out into the world, I really want to challenge you to develop a brand. I want you to become the go-to person for something. Try to develop yourself and figure out what that is. And outreach can really help you carve out that space for yourself. Think about what you can provide and become an expert in. And that could be what you have knowledge of already, or that could be you entering into a new discipline and learning as much as you can. Once you've kind of helped establish yourself to be a go-to person for something, that makes the media feel more comfortable in coming to you when they need somebody to speak on a certain issue. So it's important And especially when you're representing an organization, you're going to be doing either internal or external communication. Internal communication would be talking to um, people who are within the same discipline or industry as you. External communication would be talking to a layperson. So it pays off both for you and for your organization. When it comes to outreach, there's a lot of different ways that you can reach out to somebody. Think of all the different mediums that you can use just when it comes to social media alone. We have Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, YouTube. We also have access to a lot of popular press pieces, op-eds, magazines, newspapers, blogs. And when it comes to the form that we can do outreach, written, multimedia, etc., there's lots of different ways that we can package this information. Outreach is not about you necessarily, it's about the audience. You probably won't be talking too much about the actual research that has provided the facts that you want to convey to your audience. It's a high level of detail, and that level of detail will be too much for most audiences. You really have to zoom out and figure out what the right level is to approach this. Sometimes you may have to talk about a different subject altogether because what you're talking about may be too complicated. The author of these tips provided a great example. There were some researchers who were studying depression, and they gave a public talk, but instead of talking about depression, they talked about and framed their position and their information by talking about happiness, because it's a lot more uplifting and more probably engaging to talk about happiness versus talking about depression. Dumbing it down, you want, I don't necessarily like dumbing things down. I think in a lot of cases, maybe your audiences will notice that you're dumbing it down and might take offense to it. Instead, provide a simple, clear, and concise message. You should never worry about dumbing down your subjects. All people, from mechanics to hairdressers, they simplify their message to get their points across. When you do this, when you make things simple, clear, and concise, it really doesn't degrade the science. So don't worry that you're dumbing things down. This is something that you probably don't need to worry about at this point. We're in the discipline of ag communications, and we have put you through a degree plan that provides an interdisciplinary knowledge of agriculture. So you have taken an intro to animal science and plant science, and you've taken somewhere between 9 to 15 hours of ag elective classes. So we don't expect you to be experts in any specific science. So, with that said, you are going to enter into a field, ideally, once you graduate, you'll enter into a field in agriculture. That could be animal science, that could be ag business, whatever it is, you probably will not have a full understanding of that discipline. You will have to learn. So, you will then become an expert in that field that you enter into. I want you to try to remember when you were learning all these things and becoming an expert in that discipline, what it felt like and what your questions were, because that'll really behoove you when you're trying to connect and transfer this information to a general audience. Jargon. Jargon is technical words that we use within our own sphere. And so for ag, the words that we use, we have a certain frame of reference and contextual knowledge that helps give meaning to that word. The framing and contextual knowledge varies from person to person and from social group to social group, or discipline group to discipline group. So this is super important to remember the semantics. So a prime example is using the word slaughter versus the word harvesting. A lot of us want to use the word harvesting when we're describing the process of converting muscle to meat and protein in animals, or for food animals. When we do that, we know, because of our contextual knowledge and the way that the word has been framed in the past, is that harvesting an animal means converting muscle to meat for consumption. We also know that the word slaughter means the same thing to us. But when we say the word harvest to a layperson who does not have the same contextual knowledge or frame of references, that word looks a lot different. And for right or wrong, the word harvesting for a lay person typically means harvesting plant product. So the words that we use and the jargon that we use is very, very important. Words matter. And so using jargon is probably not the best way to go about it. If you do need to use jargon, you have to ensure that that frame of reference and that contextual knowledge is there. Here's another one that is really an interesting topic. Some of y'all are going to work for commodity groups. Y'all will represent producers. And when you represent people or a group of commodity producers, there will be policy involved. So while you're an expert, you also have to push your public policy agenda. If you're a scientist, you should avoid taking side on policy. From a general audience standpoint, it makes you less credible. That's not going to be the case for everyone when you go and work for people. You're going to have a public policy agenda, and you will be working with scientists, and you'll be working with lobbyists at the same time. It's gonna be difficult at times, but that's the hand you're dealt, and that's what you're there to do. Here's the second to last one. Find the story. Please find and develop a story that can communicate or share science information. The level of impact that this has is so much greater than providing information in almost any other form. If you can provide and develop that connection, it has a great impact on the comprehension and development of a connection with your audience, by far. Don't get overstressed. Almost any communication will be beneficial in some shape or form. You just need to do outreach. People are searching for information, and they can find answers to their questions in a lot of different places. And we want to be the place for people to find information on the subject or the discipline that we are in. So to do that, you have to share information. You have to do outreach. So don't get hung up on, is this perfect? Do your best and conduct outreach. I hope this was beneficial, and on some of these tips you can use in the future. Don't forget to complete the 5 questions for the comprehensive check, and get ready for next week's content. Thanks.